In the suffocating heat of a Georgia summer in 1846, some secrets were buried so deep that even the Spanish moss seemed to whisper warnings. But when desperation meets cruelty, and when the powerless finally find their voice, even the most carefully guarded family shame can explode into something far more dangerous than anyone ever imagined. This is the story of 4 young souls who discovered that sometimes the most unlikely alliances can shatter chains that have bound generations. Subscribe to our channel for more untold historical stories that will leave you speechless. The morning sun cast long shadows across Magnolia Grove plantation, its golden rays filtering through the ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of Whitmore family secrets. The air hung thick with humidity and the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms, but beneath that southern perfume lay something darker, the unmistakable tension that comes when power is threatened and desperation takes hold. Eleanor Whitmore stood on the grand veranda of her antebellum mansion, her steel-grey eyes surveying the cotton fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon like a white ocean frozen in time. At 52, she possessed the kind of austere beauty that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, silver hair pulled back in a severe chignon that seemed to stretch her features into permanent disapproval, and a spine so straight it seemed forged from the same iron that had built her family's fortune. The mansion behind her was a testament to 3 generations of Whitmore prosperity. Massive white columns supported a wraparound veranda that offered commanding views of the plantation's operations. Inside, crystal chandeliers imported from France caught the morning light, while Persian rugs covered floors of polished heart pine. Every detail spoke of wealth, refinement, and the absolute certainty that came with generations of unquestioned authority. But 6 months had passed since her husband Charles's sudden death from yellow fever, and Eleanor had discovered that maintaining that authority required constant vigilance. The overseer, Thomas McKinnon, had initially questioned her right to give orders, his weathered face showing the kind of skepticism that Southern men reserved for women who dared to step outside their prescribed roles. But one cold stare from those grey eyes, followed by a quiet threat to replace him with someone more amenable to female leadership, had silenced his protests permanently. She ruled the plantation now with calculated precision, every decision measured against its potential impact on the Whitmore name. The cotton crop was thriving under her management, the slaves were productive, if not happy, and the plantation's finances were healthier than they had been in years. But there was one problem that all her intelligence and determination couldn't solve, one source of shame that threatened to unravel everything she had worked to preserve. Her sons. "Mama, you sent for us." The voice belonged to William, her eldest at 26, and the sound of it made Eleanor's jaw clench with familiar frustration. There was something in his tone, a softness, a hesitancy, that grated against every expectation she held for the future master of Magnolia Grove. He appeared at the veranda door, flanked by his younger brothers, James and Robert, all 3 bearing the same pale complexion, refined features, and nervous disposition that had become the source of Eleanor's deepest shame. "Sit down, boys." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience, the kind of tone that had cowed field hands and house slaves alike for decades. The 3 young men arranged themselves on the wicker furniture, with movements that were careful and measured, as if afraid to disturb the morning air or draw their mother's critical attention. Eleanor's gaze swept over her sons with the clinical assessment of a general reviewing troops before battle, and what she saw filled her with a mixture of disappointment and growing desperation. William, the heir to everything, possessed a gentle nature that she found utterly unsuitable for managing a plantation of this size and complexity. While other young men his age were establishing themselves as forces to be reckoned with in county society, William spent his days reading poetry by the creek, tending to watercolor paintings of flowers and landscapes, and writing what he called philosophical observations in leather-bound journals. These were activities that would have been perfectly acceptable, even admirable for a daughter, but they were scandalous for the future master of one of Georgia's most prosperous plantations. James, the middle son at 24, showed some promise in the plantation's bookkeeping and had a head for numbers that impressed even Eleanor. But his tendency to stutter when addressing the field hands, his inability to maintain eye contact when giving orders, and his habit of apologizing for every directive undermined any authority he might have commanded. The slaves had learned to take advantage of his weakness, completing tasks slowly or incompletely, knowing that James would never follow through on threats of punishment. And Robert, her youngest at 22, had developed what Eleanor considered the most dangerous trait of all, an inappropriate familiarity with the plantation's slaves. She had caught him on multiple occasions, sharing meals with house servants, asking about their families, even teaching some of the younger ones to read, despite the laws that made such education illegal. His behavior wasn't just unseemly, it was potentially explosive in a society built on the absolute separation between master and slave. "I've been hearing things," Eleanor began, her voice cutting through the humid morning air like a blade through silk. "Whispers, speculation about this family's capabilities." The three brothers exchanged glances, a silent communication that Eleanor had observed countless times throughout their lives. They had always been close, perhaps too close, finding comfort in each other's company, rather than seeking the rough camaraderie of other plantation sons. While their peers spent their time hunting, drinking, gambling, and establishing their dominance over slaves and social inferiors, the Whitmore boys preferred quiet conversations, shared books, and what Eleanor considered an unhealthy sensitivity to the suffering of others. "What kind of whispers, Mama?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and Eleanor noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, the kind that question whether the Whitmore men are truly men at all. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, heavy with implications that made all three brothers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Mrs. Caldwell mentioned at last week's social that her daughter Rebecca has been waiting for a proposal from you, William, for over 2 years. 2 years, and what have you given her? Poetry readings and pressed flowers like some lovesick schoolgirl." William's face flushed crimson, the color spreading from his collar to his hairline. "Rebecca is a lovely girl, Mama, but I don't. I mean, I'm not certain that we're well suited for—" "But nothing!" Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip, causing a mockingbird in the nearby magnolia tree to take flight in alarm. "You are 26 years old, the heir to one of Georgia's most prosperous plantations, and you're behaving like a maiden aunt with romantic notions. Do you have any idea what people are saying? Do you understand how your behavior reflects on this family's reputation?" She turned her attention to James, her grey eyes boring into him with laser-like intensity. "And you, James, when was the last time you asserted any real authority over the field hands? They laugh behind your back, because you can't string 2 words together without stammering like a child. Yesterday I watched you ask a field hand to please consider working a little faster. You asked him, as if his comfort and convenience were more important than the productivity of this plantation." James's stutter immediately worsened under his mother's scrutiny. I try, Mama, but they don't seem to respect. Respect is taken, not given." Eleanor slammed her palm against the veranda railing with such force that the sound echoed across the plantation grounds like a gunshot. Several slaves working in the nearby garden looked up in alarm, before quickly returning their attention to their tasks. "Your father never asked for respect. He commanded it through strength, through the absolute certainty that he was master, and they were property, but you three—" She shook her head in disgust. "You act as if you're afraid of them." Her attention turned to Robert, and her voice took on an even more dangerous edge. "And you, my youngest disappointment, I've heard reports of you sharing meals with the house slaves, sharing meals, as if they were your equals, as if the natural order of things meant nothing at all." Robert, who had inherited more of his father's spirit than his brothers, but channeled it in directions that horrified his mother, Leaf. "Georgia is not my home, Robert. It never was. It was my prison." "Not Georgia," Robert said quickly. "At least not the Georgia you knew. Things have changed, Celeste. We've changed. All of us." Over the next hour, as they sat in her office with the sounds of Boston's busy streets filtering through the windows, Robert told her a story that seemed almost too incredible to believe. In the 5 years since that night in the tobacco barn, the Whitmore brothers had systematically transformed not just their own plantation but their entire corner of Georgia. Using the evidence that Celeste had gathered and additional documentation they had collected over the years, they had quietly but effectively destroyed Eleanor's power base. The woman who had once terrorized slaves and manipulated her own sons now lived in genteel poverty in a small cottage on the edge of the plantation, her influence broken and her reputation in ruins. But more importantly, they had used their positions and resources to become part of a growing network of Southern abolitionists, people who worked from within the system to undermine slavery and prepare for the changes they all knew were coming. Magnolia Grove had become a station on the Underground Railroad, its hidden rooms and secret passages helping hundreds of enslaved people find their way to freedom. "William has become quite the orator," Robert said with obvious pride. "He speaks at churches and town meetings, using his position as a plantation owner to argue that slavery is not just morally wrong, but economically destructive. And James, you wouldn't recognize James. He's become fearless, absolutely fearless. He's been working with lawyers in Atlanta to challenge the legal foundations of slavery itself." "And you?" Celeste asked quietly. Robert's face grew serious. "I've been learning, reading everything I can about law, about justice, about the kind of world we want to build when this is all over. And I've been thinking about you. Every day for 5 years I've been thinking about you." The words hung between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Celeste felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble, but she forced herself to remain practical. "Even if what you're saying is true," she said carefully, "even if you've somehow managed to transform your little corner of the South, I'm still a black woman and you're still a white man. In Georgia, it means we'll have to be careful," Robert interrupted. "It means we'll have to be creative. It means we'll have to fight for every moment of happiness we can find. But Celeste, the world is changing faster than anyone imagined. There's going to be a war, everyone knows it. And when it's over, when slavery is finally abolished, we'll need people who understand both sides. People who can help build bridges between the old world and the new." "You're asking me to give up everything I've built here," Celeste said, gesturing around her office. "My work, my safety, my independence." "I'm asking you to help us build something even bigger," Robert replied. "I'm asking you to come home and help us create the kind of South that should have existed all along, a place where people like us can not only survive but thrive." Celeste was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing with possibilities and dangers. The practical part of her knew that Robert's proposal was incredibly risky, that returning to the South, even a changed South, would put her in constant danger. But another part of her, the part that had never forgotten the courage he had shown that night in the tobacco barn, was tempted by the possibility of building something meaningful together. "There's something else," Robert said quietly. "Something I haven't told you yet." "What?" "We found her. Your mother's sister, the one she used to tell you stories about. She's alive, Celeste. She's free, and she's been looking for you." The words hit Celeste like a physical blow. Her mother had spoken often of her sister Sarah, who had been sold away when they were children, but Celeste had always assumed she was dead. The possibility that she might still have family, real family, in the world was almost too much to process. "Where?" she whispered. "Charleston. She's been working with the Underground Railroad there, helping people escape by ship to the north. When she heard about a young woman named Celeste who was doing similar work in Boston, she asked us to find you." Tears began to form in Celeste's eyes as she realized that Robert wasn't just offering her a chance to return to the South, he was offering her a chance to reclaim the family that slavery had stolen from her. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Robert replied, rising from his chair. "I'm staying at the Parker House Hotel. I'll be in Boston for a week, handling some business for the railroad. But Celeste—" He paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know that meeting you, working with you that night, it changed everything for me. You showed me what real courage looks like, and I've been trying to live up to that example ever since." After he left, Celeste sat alone in her office as the afternoon shadows grew longer, wrestling with the most difficult decision of her life. Outside her window, Boston continued its busy rhythm, but her mind was hundreds of miles away, in a place where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks and the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with the promise of change. 3 days later, she made her choice. The letter she sent to Robert was brief but decisive. "I'll come. Not because I believe the South can truly change, but because I believe we can change it, and because some fights are worth the risk." 6 months later, in a small ceremony attended only by William, James, and a handful of trusted friends, Robert Whitmore married Celeste in a hidden grove on what had once been Magnolia Grove Plantation. The marriage wasn't legal under Georgia law, but it was real in every way that mattered to them. Together, they continued the work they had begun that night in the tobacco barn, fighting for justice, building networks of resistance, and preparing for the war that would finally end the institution that had shaped all their lives. When that war came, they were ready. And when it ended, they were among the first to begin building the new world that would rise from the ashes of the old. The unspoken pact that Eleanor Whitmore had tried to impose on her sons had been broken completely, replaced by something far more powerful, a spoken promise between two people who had learned that love, real love, was not about power or possession, but about standing together against the darkness and refusing to let it win. And in the end, that promise proved stronger than all the chains that had ever been forged. In the suffocating heat of that Georgia summer in 1846, 4 young souls discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite that fear. Celeste's journey from bondage to freedom and the Whitmore brothers' transformation from weakness to moral strength reminds us that even in history's darkest chapters, the human spirit finds ways to rise above cruelty and claim its dignity. Their story teaches us that sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when ordinary people decide they've had enough of being ordinary victims. It shows us that love, real love, is not about power or possession, but about standing together against injustice and refusing to let darkness win. Most importantly, it reminds us that change is always possible, even when it seems impossible, that one person's courage can inspire others to find their own strength, and that sometimes the most unlikely alliances can indeed shatter chains that have bound generations. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more incredible untold stories from history that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about courage, freedom, and the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest circumstances.